The air in the wolf's lair, even in the stifling embrace of July, held a perpetual chill. Not the biting cold of winter, but a subterranean dampness, a miasma of concrete and fear that clung to everything. Deep within this concrete beast, nestled in the dense forests of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler paced. His boots, polished to a mirror sheen, echoed on the linoleum flooring of his private chambers, a restless rhythm that mirrored the unease gnawing at him. Outside, the summer sun beat down, oblivious to the darkness that festered within these reinforced walls. But inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken anxieties, a palpable tension that even the most seasoned SS guards could feel prickling at their skin. It was July 20th, 1944. A date that would soon be seared into the annals of history, a date when the very foundations of the Third Reich would tremble. For weeks, a clandestine group of officers, their hearts heavy with the weight of a collapsing Germany, had plotted. They were men who had once believed, men who had served with loyalty and zeal, only to witness their Führer's escalating madness and the catastrophic trajectory of his war. Their ranks were thinning, their strategies crumbling, and the once invincible Wehrmacht was now bleeding out on fronts across the globe. This was their last, desperate gamble. In a quiet corner of the sprawling headquarters, far from the Führer's immediate orbit, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg stood, his face a mask of grim determination. The remnants of his left arm, a stark reminder of his bravery in North Africa, were tucked beneath his uniform jacket. His right hand, though functional, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the task before him. He clutched a worn leather briefcase, its contents a ticking clock of destruction. Inside, nestled amongst innocuous documents, lay a meticulously crafted bomb, its fuse a fragile conduit to oblivion. Stauffenberg's journey to this point had been a descent into a moral abyss. He had witnessed the barbarity of the regime firsthand, the systematic extermination, the senseless sacrifice of German lives for a delusional vision. He had wrestled with his conscience, with his oaths, with the very fabric of his being. The plot, codenamed Valkyrie, was not born of personal ambition, but of a desperate hope to salvage what little remained of Germany, to extricate her from the Führer's clutches before she was utterly annihilated. The Inner Circle, a clandestine network of disillusioned military leaders, politicians, and intellectuals, had finally settled on this day, this meeting, as their singular opportunity. The Führer's primary command bunker, the Wolf's Lair, was a fortress within a fortress. Layers of concrete, steel, and earth, designed to withstand the full fury of Allied bombing, contained the nerve center of Hitler's war machine. But even the most formidable defenses could be breached by the insidious creep of betrayal. Stauffenberg, a man of impeccable military record and undeniable courage, was their chosen instrument. His access, his position, his very proximity to Hitler made him the linchpin of Valkyrie. The morning air was humid, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling Stauffenberg's lungs as he made his way towards the conference building. Each step felt heavier than the last, each breath a conscious effort to quell the rising tide of adrenaline. He saw the usual patrols, the stern faces of the SS, the soldiers going about their duties with an air of forced normalcy. They were oblivious to the seismic shift that was about to occur, to the desperate act of treason being carried out within their midst. He met with General Ulbricht, his co-conspirator, a man whose weary eyes held a flicker of the same desperate hope. They exchanged hushed words, a final confirmation of their plan. Stauffenberg's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. He was carrying not just a bomb, but the weight of a nation's potential salvation, or its utter damnation. The conference room was a sterile, functional space, typical of the Wolf's Lair's utilitarian design. A long, heavy oak table dominated the room, surrounded by chairs. Maps and charts adorned the walls, testament to the global conflict raging outside. Hitler, a figure both commanding and unnerving, was already present, surrounded by his inner circle of generals and advisors. His voice, a high-pitched, reedy instrument, filled the room as he droned on about troop movements and strategic objectives. Stauffenberg, his face carefully schooled into an expression of attentive deference, took his assigned seat. The briefcase, containing the bomb, was placed discreetly beneath the table, near his feet. He could feel the heat emanating from the device, a subtle warmth that seemed to seep through the thick leather. The timer, meticulously set, was ticking away. He glanced at Hitler, his eyes, usually so piercing, now glazed with a feverish intensity. The man was a phantom, a specter haunting the ruins of his own creation. Stauffenberg's mind raced, a chaotic swirl of duty, desperation, and a chilling certainty of what was to come. He was here to end it, to sever the head of the serpent, to bring an end to the bloodshed. He fumbled with his notes, his fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. He needed to excuse himself, to activate the device, to set in motion the chain of events that would hopefully, God willing, change the course of the war. The air in the room was thick, not just with the summer heat, but with the unspoken dread that hovered over every meeting with the Führer. Stauffenberg felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea, a primal reaction to the enormity of his undertaking. He was a soldier, trained to obey, trained to kill. But this was a different kind of war. A war waged with a conscience, a war for the soul of his nation. He took a deep, shaky breath, the scent of stale cigar smoke and the faint metallic tang of fear filling his nostrils. The moment was fast approaching. The humid morning air pressed in, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a stark contrast to the stifling embrace of the concrete beast that was the wolf's lair. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the sprawling headquarters. He clutched the worn leather briefcase, its smooth surface slick with the sweat of his palm. The weight of it was negligible, yet it contained the crushing burden of a nation's potential salvation, or its utter damnation. He had meticulously schooled his features into a mask of grim determination, a practiced deference to the Führer's presence. But beneath the veneer of military discipline, a tempest raged. Each step he took towards the conference building felt like a descent into a moral abyss, a departure from the man he once was. The remnants of his left arm, a stark reminder of his bravery on other fronts, throbbed with a phantom ache, a visceral echo of the physical toll this war had already exacted. Now, a different kind of war, a war waged with a conscience, was consuming him. Inside the conference room, the air crackled with palpable tension, a nervous energy that pricked at their skin. Maps and charts, depicting the escalating madness of the Third Reich's catastrophic trajectory, were spread across the long, heavy oak table. The summer sun beat down, oblivious to the darkness that festered within these reinforced walls, a darkness that gnawed at him, at them all. Hitler, perched at the head of the table, was a figure both commanding and unnerving, his face glazed with a feverish intensity, his voice a high-pitched, reedy instrument that seemed to drone on about troop movements and strategic objectives. He was a phantom, a specter haunting the ruins of his own creation. Stauffenberg found his assigned seat, a discreet distance from the Führer, yet close enough for his purpose. He placed the briefcase carefully beneath the table, its contents a fragile conduit to oblivion. The heat emanating from the device, a subtle warmth against his leg, felt like a living entity, a coiled serpent waiting for the signal. He fumbled with his notes, his fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. a stark contrast to the meticulous precision he usually displayed. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, each iteration ending with the same desperate hope, the same chilling certainty that this was their singular opportunity to sever the head of the serpent. He glanced at General Ulbricht, his co-conspirator, a man whose weary eyes held a flicker of the same desperate hope. Their unspoken pact hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the immensity of their undertaking. The other officers, oblivious to the seismic shift about to occur, continued their attentive deference, their faces etched with a forced normalcy that belied the gnawing unease that had settled over them all in recent months. They were soldiers, trained to obey, but even the most disciplined among them could not entirely ignore the escalating barbarity of the regime, the systematic extermination, the senseless sacrifice. Stauffenberg's gaze flickered back to Hitler. The Führer, engrossed in a report, gestured with his right hand, his left arm resting on the table. The bomb, meticulously crafted to unleash its fury at precisely the right moment, was ticking down. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile fabric of his being. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, a primal reaction to the enormity of his undertaking. This was not the clean, decisive action of the battlefield. This was a desperate gamble, a plunge into the unknown. He subtly shifted his position, his right hand reaching beneath the table, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of the briefcase. The device was set. The chain of events, once initiated, would be irreversible. He closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, picturing his wife, Nina, her face a distant memory, a beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. He had promised her he would try to salvage what little remained, to extricate her from the Führer's clutches, to prevent further devastation. God willing, this would be the catalyst. He opened his eyes, his vision blurring slightly. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the metallic tang of fear mingling with the stale cigar smoke. He could almost feel the tremors that would soon ripple through the concrete walls, the shattering of glass, the screams that would follow. He was about to unleash a storm, a tempest of destruction that would either cleanse Germany of its current madness or plunge it further into utter annihilation. A low hum, almost imperceptible, began to emanate from the briefcase. It was the sound of impending doom, the final desperate act of a disillusioned military leader. He withdrew his hand, his fingers tingling. The mechanism was engaged. He had done all he could. Now he could only wait, and pray that death, for once, would not refuse its grim task. The minutes that followed were a torturous descent into an unbearable suspense. The droning voice of Hitler continued, oblivious to the ticking clock of destruction nestled beneath the table. Stauffenberg's own breathing became shallow, ragged, each inhalation a struggle. He could feel the sweat trickling down his temples, the tremor in his hands now a visible tremor. He had to maintain his composure, to project an air of normalcy until the moment of detonation. Suddenly, a voice at the far end of the table, General Keitel's, broke the monotony. Keitel was requesting permission to move a map, to get a better view of the terrain. Hitler, his patience already tested by the relentless pressure of the war, became agitated. He stood up, his movements jerky, and moved towards the map, which had been placed on a sturdy wooden stand near the window. This was not part of the plan. The bomb was positioned to be most effective when Hitler was seated. Stauffenberg's blood ran cold. The reinforced concrete walls, designed to withstand aerial bombardment, were also designed to absorb shock waves. But if Hitler moved, if the blast was too dispersed, it might not be enough. A bead of sweat, cold and heavy, rolled down Stauffenberg's cheek. He watched, his gaze locked on Hitler, as the Führer, his back now partially turned to the table, leaned over the map. The minutes ticked by, each second an agonizing eternity. The hum of the device seemed to grow louder in Stauffenberg's ears, a deafening roar that drowned out the droning voices around him. He could feel the eyes of several officers on him, sensing his unusual stillness, the tension radiating from his posture. But he could not afford to draw attention. He had to wait. Then a sharp crack, like a thunderclap, echoed through the room. It was followed immediately by a deafening roar, a concussive blast that threw Stauffenberg from his chair. The world dissolved into a chaotic swirl of dust, debris, and searing heat. The reinforced walls groaned under the immense pressure, and the air filled with the acrid stench of cordite. He was thrown against the wall, the impact jarring him to his core. For a moment, all he could hear was the ringing in his ears, a high-pitched whine that threatened to consume him. When his vision cleared, he saw a scene of utter devastation. The heavy oak table was splintered, its polished surface scorched. Papers were scattered everywhere, some still smoldering. The ceiling was partially collapsed, and dust billowed in thick clouds, choking the air. He pushed himself up, his body a mass of aches and pains. His first desperate thought was of Hitler. Had it been enough? Had he succeeded in severing the head of the serpent? He scanned the room, his eyes stinging from the dust. Amidst the wreckage, he saw figures stirring, groaning, struggling to rise. Then, he saw him. Adolf Hitler, his uniform torn and singed, his face blackened with soot, was being helped to his feet. He was alive. The bomb had exploded. The blast had ripped through the room. But miraculously, Hitler had survived. The thick oak table, it seemed, had absorbed the brunt of the blast, its sturdy construction, ironically, serving as a shield. The bomb, intended to be the fragile conduit to oblivion, had become a near miss, a catastrophic failure. A wave of despair, cold and absolute, washed over Stauffenberg. He had failed. The desperate hope that had fueled him, that had sustained him through weeks of clandestine planning and gnawing fear, had been extinguished in a single, deafening explosion. He had gambled with the fate of Germany, and he had lost. The specter of his failure would now haunt him, a grim reminder of a mission gone awry. He had to escape, to regroup, to find a way to salvage what little remained of their desperate plan, or to face the inevitable consequences. The fabric of his being felt torn, shredded by the enormity of his failure. The war, he knew, would continue, its catastrophic trajectory unaltered, and the darkness would continue to fester. The roar of the explosion was a physical blow, a concussive wave that slammed against Stauffenberg's eardrums and vibrated through the very marrow of his bones. Dust billowed in a choking cloud, obscuring the scene for a disorienting moment. The miasma of concrete and fear that perpetually clung to the wolf's lair thickened, now laced with the acrid scent of detonated explosives. He saw it then, through the settling debris, the splintered remains of the heavy oak table, the scattered papers, the twisted metal. And amidst the chaos, a figure stirring, impossibly, miraculously, rising from the wreckage. Hitler. A guttural cry, a sound that was more animalistic than human, tore from Stauffenberg's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated despair, a testament to the brutal shattering of his desperate hope. He had seen the Führer's shadowed form move, had seen the briefcase, carefully placed, meticulously set to unleash its destructive payload. He had felt the tremor beneath his feet, the grim satisfaction that momentarily flared in his chest, a fragile conduit to oblivion. But the table, that damned thick oak table, had stood between the blast and its intended target. It had absorbed the shock, had deflected the lethal shrapnel. The air thrummed with a sudden, frantic energy. Shouts erupted, a cacophony of alarm and confusion. SS guards, their faces a mask of grim determination, scrambled into the room, weapons drawn. Stauffenberg, his heart hammering against his ribs, A frantic drumbeat against the silence that had descended in the wake of the blast forced his limbs to move. He had to escape. He had to reach his co-conspirators. The chain of events, so carefully orchestrated, had snapped. But Valkyrie was still in motion. He pushed through the stunned bodies, his mind a chaotic swirl of duty and dread. The carefully schooled facade he had maintained for weeks, for months, threatened to crack. His right hand, though functional, trembled slightly as he clutched the worn leather briefcase he had left behind. A deliberate ruse. His gaze swept over the scene, cataloging the damage, the injured, the disoriented faces. He saw Hitler being helped by his aides, a figure limping, dazed, but undeniably alive. The sheer, improbable resilience of the man was a chilling certainty, a testament to the dark forces that seemed to protect him. Stauffenberg moved with a practiced urgency, his military training kicking in, overriding the primal reaction to the enormity of his undertaking and its catastrophic failure. He navigated the corridors of the subterranean bunker, each step a heavy thud on the linoleum flooring, each breath a struggle against the stifling air. He had only moments, a fleeting window before the alarm would be fully raised, before his own presence in the room would be scrutinized. The metallic tang of fear, ever present in this concrete beast, was now a sharp, biting presence in his nostrils. He reached the exterior, the humid July air a welcome, if fleeting, balm. The summer sun beat down, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred within the earth beneath his feet. Soldiers moved about their duties, their faces a mixture of routine and unease, unaware of the desperate gamble that had been played out mere yards away. He saw his waiting staff car, a discreet black vehicle, and the driver's anxious face. "Schnell!" Stauffenberg barked, his voice rough. As he climbed into the car, the driver, a young man whose loyalty was to the uniform and not necessarily the man inside, shot him a questioning glance. Stauffenberg met his gaze, his own eyes a carefully constructed mask of urgency, of duty. He had to project an image of a man caught in the aftermath, a man whose world had just been violently disrupted. "There has been an incident," he stated, his voice low and controlled, a stark contrast to the tempest raging within him. "An explosion. We must depart immediately." The drive back to his headquarters was a blur of frantic thoughts and gnawing despair. The carefully crafted plan, the intricate network of allies, the hope of igniting a civil war, of wresting Germany from its catastrophic trajectory, all of it seemed to hang by a thread that had just been brutally severed. He replayed the moments in the conference room. Had he miscalculated the fuse? Had the tilt of the table been more pronounced than he anticipated? Had the guards moved Hitler at the last second? The what-ifs swarmed him, a relentless tide of self-recrimination. He reached the Bendler block, the sprawling headquarters of the Army Personnel Office, now the nerve center of Valkyrie. The atmosphere was electric, a palpable tension that had been building for weeks, now amplified by the news of the attempted assassination. General Ulbricht, his face a mask of weary grimness, met him in the hallway. The general's eyes, usually filled with a quiet resolve, now held a flicker of something akin to panic. "Klaus?" Ulbricht's voice was a hushed rasp. "What happened? We heard a blast." Stauffenberg's carefully schooled composure finally faltered. He ran a hand over his face, the rough stubble a stark reminder of the sleepless nights. "It failed, Erich," he said, the words heavy with defeat. "The Führer. He survived." Ulbricht's shoulders slumped, the color drained from his face, leaving him pale and drawn. "Survived?" he echoed, the word a death knell. "How? The charges?" "The table," Stauffenberg explained, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The heavy oak table. It absorbed the blast. He's injured, but alive." A profound silence descended between them, broken only by the distant sounds of hurried footsteps and hushed voices. The carefully constructed edifice of Valkyrie, built on the premise of decapitating the regime, now teetered on the brink of collapse. The coup, the meticulously planned transfer of power, the broadcast announcing Hitler's death, all of it hinged on the success of the assassination. Without it, they were not liberators, but traitors, their actions now liable to swift and brutal retribution. "What now?" Ulbricht asked, his voice barely audible. Stauffenberg looked at his mentor, at the man who had placed his faith in this desperate gamble. He saw the fear in Ulbricht's eyes, a fear that mirrored his own, but also a flicker of the same unwavering resolve that had driven them both. "Now," Stauffenberg said, his voice regaining a measure of its former strength, though tinged with a deep weariness. "We continue. The orders have been issued. The reserves are mobilizing. We must assume the regime will believe the assassination was successful. We must exploit the confusion. We must make them believe he is dead. It was a desperate hope, a fragile conduit to salvation. But it was all they had left. The foundation of the Third Reich had been shaken, even if its figurehead remained. The barbarity of the regime, the systematic extermination, the senseless sacrifice. These were the specters that haunted Stauffenberg's waking hours, the driving force behind his audacious act. He had wrestled with his conscience, with the weight of his own complicity in the war's escalating madness. He had believed that removing Hitler was the only path to redemption, the only way to salvage what little remained of Germany's soul. But the Führer, that phantom, that specter haunting the ruins of his own creation, had cheated death. And now, the consequences of their failed attempt loomed large, a dark shadow cast over the already bleeding-out nation. The remaining hours. The hours in which Valkyrie would attempt to seize control would be a race against time, a desperate struggle against a regime that would unleash its full fury upon any who dared defy it. Stauffenberg knew, with a chilling certainty, that the repercussions of this day would be etched into the annals of history, a stark reminder of a desperate act of treason and a leader who, by some cruel twist of fate, refused to be taken. The war was far from over, and for those who had dared to challenge the Führer, a different kind of war, a war for their very lives, had just begun. The concussive force of the explosion, a deafening roar that ripped through the subterranean dampness of the conference room, had been Stauffenberg's fragile conduit to oblivion. He had been outside, a calculated distance away, the thick walls of the wolf's lair offering a perverse form of protection from the blast he initiated. Yet the shockwave had still slammed into him, a physical blow that sent him reeling. For a breathless instant, the miasma of concrete and fear that permeated the sprawling headquarters seemed to solidify, then shatter. He had seen the blinding flash, felt the tremor beneath his worn leather boots, and then a gnawing anticipation, a desperate hope that the unthinkable had occurred. He had raced back towards the bunker, his heart a frantic drumbeat against the silence that followed the initial chaos. The scene that greeted him was a tableau of devastation, yet eerily incomplete. Debris lay scattered, splinters of wood and fabric, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of cordite. Men, stunned and bleeding, stumbled from the building, but amidst the wreckage, a spectral figure began to emerge, dazed but undeniably alive. Hitler. The bomb, meticulously crafted, positioned with such precision, had failed. The heavy oak table, a utilitarian piece of furniture, had become an accidental shield, deflecting the lethal shrapnel, saving the Führer from the catastrophic trajectory of his own escalating madness. Stauffenberg's carefully schooled composure began to fray at the edges, The meticulously set plan, the linchpin of Valkyrie, was now teetering on the precipice of disaster. He had been trained to obey, to execute orders with unwavering precision, but this was a different kind of war, a war waged with a conscience, a war for the soul of his nation. And in that moment, witnessing the impossible survival of the man he had sworn to depose, doubt, cold and sharp, pricked at his skin. He moved through the throng, his face a mask of grim determination, his remnants of his left arm, a stark reminder of his bravery and the barbarity of the regime, clutched to his chest. He needed confirmation, a definitive report. He found General Ulbricht, his co-conspirator, a man whose weary eyes held a flicker of the same desperate hope, now clouded with a dawning horror. "He lives, Klaus." Ulbricht's voice was a low rasp, barely audible above the rising din of confusion and concern. "He is injured, but he lives." The words struck Stauffenberg like another physical blow. The carefully constructed edifice of their desperate gamble was crumbling. The chain of events they had so meticulously orchestrated, from the activation of the device to the dissemination of the coup orders, was now predicated on a lie that was rapidly dissolving. They had gambled everything on the assumption of Hitler's death, on the belief that his demise would sever the head of the serpent, paralyzing the regime and creating a vacuum they could exploit. Instead, the serpent, wounded but alive, now coiled with an even more terrifying fury. The news spread like wildfire, a chilling certainty that began to seep into the very foundations of their clandestine operation. The initial reports of Hitler's survival were met with disbelief, then with a creeping dread that settled over the conspirators like a shroud. The SS, a formidable force in their own right, began to mobilize, their stern faces betraying no hint of the seismic shift that had occurred. The soldiers going about their duties with an air of forced normalcy were oblivious to the desperate act of treason that had just unfolded, and the brutal retribution that was now inevitable. Stauffenberg knew, with a chilling certainty, that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The initial confusion, the brief moment of uncertainty that had been their greatest ally, was evaporating. The loyalists within the regime, those who clung to the delusional vision of the Third Reich, would rally. And those who had wavered, those who had been waiting for a sign, would now retreat into the shadows, their courage extinguished by the sheer, unyielding will of the man they had tried to eliminate. He had to get back to Berlin. The coup, codenamed Valkyrie, was already in motion, but it was a fragile conduit, dependent on the narrative of Hitler's death. He had to reinforce that narrative, to buy his co-conspirators time, even as the foundations of their plan began to crack. He boarded a plane, the humid morning air of East Prussia, a stark contrast to the stifling embrace of the bunker. The scent of pine needles and damp earth was a fleeting comfort, a reminder of a Germany he desperately hoped to salvage from the precipice of utter annihilation. As the plane climbed, leaving the reinforced walls of the Wolf's Lair behind, Stauffenberg wrestled with his conscience, with the sheer weight of the task he had undertaken. He had seen the barbarity of the regime, the systematic extermination, the senseless sacrifice. He had believed, with every fiber of his being, that this was the only way to end the suffering, to extricate Germany from the Führer's destructive clutches. But now, staring into the abyss of failure, he wondered if he had merely prolonged the agony, if his desperate gamble had been a catastrophic miscalculation. Back in Berlin, the wheels of Valkyrie were turning, albeit with an increasing sense of unease. General Ulbricht and his allies within the Bendler Bloc, the War Ministry, were disseminating orders, initiating the transfer of military units, attempting to secure key communication centers. They worked with a grim determination, their faces etched with the unspoken dread of what was to come. The hushed words exchanged, the frantic drumbeat of their actions against the silence of impending discovery, spoke of a desperate hope that they could still salvage something from the wreckage. But the news from the wolf's lair was a poisoned chalice. The initial reports of Hitler's survival, though officially downplayed, began to filter through the ranks. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors in the suffocating atmosphere of the Third Reich could be more deadly than any bomb. The SS, under the relentless direction of Himmler and Kaltenbrunner, began to move with swift, brutal efficiency. They were a formidable force, their loyalty to the Führer unquestioning, their methods unforgiving. The network of informants, the insidious creep of betrayal that had always been a shadow lurking within the regime, began to tighten its grip. Stauffenberg's arrival in Berlin was met with a palpable tension. The carefully constructed normalcy of the War Ministry was shattered. The air crackled with an almost electric anxiety. Men who had been prepared to risk everything now looked at each other with a flicker of fear in their eyes. The singular opportunity, the moment of weakness they had so desperately sought, had passed. He found Ulbricht in his office, the maps and charts spread across his desk like the scattered remnants of their failed ambition. The room, usually a sterile, functional space, felt suffocated by the weight of their undertaking. The polished linoleum flooring gleamed dully under the harsh electric light, and the faint scent of stale cigar smoke hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. "The radio transmission. It's been delayed," Ulbricht said, his voice strained. "They are waiting for confirmation of the Führer's death." Stauffenberg nodded, understanding the implicit message. The narrative was unraveling. The lie that had been their foundation was being exposed. He had to act, to create a new reality, to force the coup forward, even without the crucial element of Hitler's demise. He had to become the embodiment of that lie, the unwavering conviction that the Führer was gone and that Germany needed new leadership. He walked towards the window, looking out at the sprawling city, a city oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred, and the brutal reckoning that was surely coming. The summer sun beat down, a stark contrast to the darkness that festered within the hearts of men. He had gambled with the fate of his nation, with the lives of his co-conspirators, and the outcome was now a terrifying unknown. The meticulous plan, the desperate hope, the years of disillusionment, all of it had converged on this single, catastrophic moment. And as the SS began to close in, their heavy boots echoing on the linoleum, Stauffenberg knew that death, which had so narrowly refused to take Hitler, would not be so forgiving with him. The clock of destruction, for the conspirators, was ticking with a relentless, unforgiving rhythm. The splintered remnants of the oak table, scorched and twisted, offered a stark testament to the near catastrophe. Smoke, acrid and suffocating, still clung to the reinforced walls of the Wolf's Lair conference room, a miasma of concrete and fear mingling with the metallic tang of explosives. For a heart-stopping moment, the world had ceased to spin, replaced by a deafening roar and a blinding flash. Then, silence, broken only by the frantic shouts of SS guards and the groans of the injured. Adolf Hitler, miraculously, was on his feet. Dazed, his uniform scorched and torn, he blinked against the dust motes dancing in the fractured sunlight that now pierced the gloom. His ears rang, a high-pitched whine that threatened to drown out all other sound. But his eyes, wide and glazed with a feverish intensity, scanned the wreckage. He was alive. The bomb, meticulously placed by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, had detonated with the force of a vengeful god, yet death, that ever-present specter, had once again refused its claim. Stauffenberg, his face a mask of grim determination, etched with the gnawing realization of failure, had already melted into the chaotic swirl. He had seen the blast, felt its concussive force even from his vantage point, and for a fleeting instant, a desperate hope had flared within him. But the table, that solid, immovable object, had become an inadvertent shield, absorbing the lethal energy that was meant to sever the head of the serpent. Now, the clock was ticking, and the carefully orchestrated chain of events was unraveling with terrifying speed. Outside the subterranean dampness of the bunker, the humid July air hung heavy, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The summer sun beat down, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred within the sprawling headquarters. Soldiers went about their duties with an air of forced normalcy, their stern faces betraying nothing of the clandestine plot that had been set in motion. The forces of the SS, their black uniforms a stark contrast to the verdant landscape, began to mobilize. Their movements swift and brutal, their purpose chillingly clear. In Berlin, the news of the assassination attempt, distorted and fragmented, began to ripple through the corridors of power. General Ulbricht, his heart heavy with the weight of a collapsing Germany, paced the floor of his office, his weary eyes darting towards the telephone, a fragile conduit to a rapidly deteriorating reality. The initial reports were ambiguous, a confusing tapestry of survival and chaos. Had the Führer perished? Or had this desperate gamble merely prolonged the inevitable agony? The fate of Operation Valkyrie, the meticulously crafted plan to seize control and negotiate a peace, hung precariously in the balance. Stauffenberg, his remnants of his left arm throbbing with a phantom pain, navigated the labyrinthine passages of the wolf's lair, his mind a whirlwind of desperate calculations. He had to escape, to reach the airfield, to rally the forces in Berlin, to convince them that the impossible had, against all odds, already happened. He had seen the inferno, the sheer destructive power of the device he had carried, and the fact that Hitler had emerged, however battered, was a testament to a terrifying, almost supernatural resilience. It was a resilience that mocked their efforts, that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. He encountered loyal officers, their faces etched with concern, their voices a mixture of shock and confusion. "The Führer is alive, Colonel," one stammered, his eyes wide. "A miracle." Stauffenberg forced a nod, his own expression a carefully schooled mask of relief, his voice carefully modulated. "Thank God," he replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He needed to project an image of normalcy, of continued loyalty, while the internal gears of his mind ground relentlessly, seeking an escape route from this suffocating trap. The SS, however, were not fooled. Their instincts, honed by